Hello everyone, this is Dr. Rivera. In this video, we are going to begin the Chapter 2, PowerPoint. In this video, I'm going to focus on talking about neurons. What are they and how do they work? And I'm going to finish talking about neurotransmitters, the chemicals in your brain. So first of all, your neurons, you often call them nerves or nerve cells. Neurons are just cells like other cells in your body, but they do something specific that the rest of your cells don't do as well. And that is they send messages. This is how a cell in your toe can tell your brain what's happening down in your feet or in your toes. Is because it basically sends a call, and your brain can then send a call back to your foot or to your toes via those nerves or neurons. And so this process of sensory neurons sending information to the brain, and then motor neurons sending information back to the body on how to react, this is how your nerves work. We humans have a central nervous system that is our brain. Um, and so everything is basically planned and analyzed, and decisions are made by the brain. Not all animals do this. Animals like sea stars have neurons that are very similar to yours, but they don't have a central nervous system. Instead, they have a neural net all throughout the sea star. And so when one part of the sea star wants to send a message to another one, it uses the neurons, but there's no central system that makes decisions for the entire system. It's just a neural net, whereas we do have a central system, that is your brain. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of the neuron, and I want to give you a metaphor here before we start, and that is the way signals are sent to your TV or your computer. There is some satellite up in space, and it's sending signals. And you can see here, this dish is catching the signals. That's very similar to what your dendrites are going to do, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. But now, once that dish has that, well, that's not enough. So what's going to happen is that signal is going to be sent via some cables out into an antenna, which is then going to send those signals out somewhere close. And then maybe you have a dish somewhere in your home, and that will then catch these signals, these radio signals, and through a cable or some cables, send that information into your home, right? So this process of catching and sending out, that is very similar to what your neurons do. So now let me show you that same process, but with your actual cells. Just like that dish, up here you have your cell body, and you can see that your cell body has all of these little antennae, which we call dendrites. And those dendrites, those are the things that catch the signal coming in. If they get enough of that signal, then they will send a message down at the axon into the terminal buttons or axon terminals. And then here you see them a little bit more blown up. There are chemicals there that are then going to released into the synapse. And then there is another cell with dendrite right next to it. And if those chemicals attach themselves to these new dendrites, well, then a new signal will be sent down the axon. Let me first talk a little bit about the different parts. Okay. So first of all, your neurons have cell bodies, and your cell bodies, they're just cells, the same way that all of your other cells in your body are. There are nucleus, they are filled with cytoplasm, there are vacuoles to get rid of waste, there are mitochondria for energy, there are ribosomes, there's DNA in the nucleus. These are just cells, just like the other cells in your body. But of course, there are some extra parts to a neuron. First of all, there's the nucleus. Uh, Here you have the dendrites. And as I already mentioned, your dendrites are the antenna that catch the signal being sent from the presynaptic neuron. Presynaptic means before the synapse. So the neuron before the synapse is going to send signals, and these dendrites are going to catch them. If they catch enough of those signals, enough of those chemicals, well, then they're going to send a electrical signal down the axon. Your axon are basically the longest and biggest parts uh, of your neurons. Some axons are small. They go from one part of the brain to another part of the brain right next to it. But some of them can be quite long. And if you see the picture to the right, you can see some axons just coming down the body. Now, what you're seeing there, the reason is they're so clear is because there's a lot of axons sort of wrapped around each other. And those are sort of the bigger nerves. One axon all by itself, you wouldn't be able to see the width of that with a naked eye, with your eye, but you would be able to see the length of it with your naked eye, especially if we're talking about the axons that begin towards the base of your spinal column all the way down to your fingertips. Those are super long. And the same thing is true with those axons that are towards the base of your spinal cord all the way down to your feet and toes. Those are really long. You also have some other long axons, which are going to include some of your cranial nerves. Your vagus nerve, for example, is very long. Now, you might notice, oh, by the way, you have about 1 million axons per nerve. So what you're seeing there, every little strand there has about 1 million axons wrapped in there. And in fact, you have about 100 billion neurons in your brain and body. Now, you'll notice that there are these little, sometimes sausage-looking things wrapped around the axon, and we call those myelin or myelin sheaths. You're not born with a lot of myelin, but throughout your life, you develop myelin around your axons. And specifically, from the time you're born until you're around 25 years old, you're still wrapping your axons with myelin. Right now, I imagine that most of you are in your late teens and early 20s. You have most of your myelin, but between now to around 25, you'll still have some myelin that you will uh, uh, create and use to wrap around your axons. Sometimes you'll hear people say things like, uh, your brain isn't really developed until you're around 25 years old, and that's true. And one of the reasons why people say this is because of myelin. You won't have all of it until you're around 25. Now, what your myelin does is that it covers up gates that exist all throughout the axon. And these gates open and close and open and close to let ions in and ions out. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to those slides. But basically, by covering up those gates, what the myelin does is it actually makes the impulse, that electrical impulse, move faster through the axon. Think about having a hose in your backyard, and you open up the water for the hose, and the water just kind of drips out. It doesn't come out with a lot of force. But if you put your thumb over the hole there, it will shoot out faster. That's because you're increasing the pressure now. Well, the same thing is happening with this myelin. They cover those gates and they increase the pressure to push that electrical signal out faster through the axon. Now, you'll also notice that the myelin doesn't cover the whole axon. There's still little pieces of axon that are visible or that are not covered. Well, those pieces are important because those gates that open and close are still exposed here, and that's really important because you need that. Uh, these exposed pieces of axon we called the nodes of Ranvier. Okay. Now, at the end of your axon, you have what we call axon terminals. And depending on what you're reading on the internet or which book you're reading, there are a handful of names for this piece. Sometimes they call them terminal buttons or axon terminal buttons or something along those lines. Um, these end or these axon terminals is where the chemicals are kept. What we are going to call neurotransmitters in just a little bit. But those chemicals, if you've ever heard anybody say like, oh, the chemicals in their brain weren't balanced or something like that. This is what they're talking about. They're talking about those neurotransmitters, those chemicals that exist inside the terminal buttons or the axon terminals. If an impulse gets all the way down to the axon terminals, then those chemicals will be released. Okay. Now, no two neurons ever actually touch. And so if you see the picture here, there is a terminal button and there is what will be the next neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, the neuron that comes after the synapse. And you see that they don't touch. There is a little bit of a gap there. And of course, that gap we call the synapse or the synaptic gap. And this is kind of where the real magic occurs as far as sending signals and controlling signals and what those signals might end up doing. Okay, so that empty space there between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron, we call that the synapse. People sometimes have a hard time understanding the synapse because empty space is not something that we often name, but this empty space is super important because it's where all the interaction actually occurs between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. Okay. Now, I'm going to go over what is happening there in that synapse. What is neurotransmission? How does it work? And what do these chemicals actually do? So, first of all, we're going to pretend that in the presynaptic neuron, that one has already been triggered. And so it's going to fire and it's sending an impulse down the axon. And there you see that little lightning bolt is representing our signal. And it gets all the way to the terminal buttons. And what's going to happen is then that the chemicals are going to be released into the synapse. And the chemicals have no mind of their own. They're just floating there, and they are sort of being triggered by the chemical composition of the sort of just a general liquid in your brain, and of course, the chemical makeup of the receptors. And the receptors that you're seeing here are in blue. So eventually they'll float around long enough so that they'll try to bond to one of those receptors. And if they get close enough, then they'll click in. And if enough of these click in at the same time, they will make the next neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, fire. And the whole process will occur again in the next synapse. Now, if the neuron is not if the neurotransmitter is not the correct shape, you see that it's a different shape. when they click into the receptors, well, they won't get stuck. They won't click in correctly because they're the wrong shape. This is like a lock and key scenario. You have to have the right key to open the right lock. And if it doesn't, well, then these chemicals are not going to turn on the postsynaptic neuron. And so this postsynaptic neuron will not fire. Now, sometimes a third thing can happen, which is a chemical will be released that almost fits the receptor. And if it almost fits, then it still doesn't fire. The postsynaptic neuron won't fire. But this is quite important because since they almost fit, what's going to happen is they're going to block any other neurotransmitter that is going to try to get into that receptor. And so I'm going to show you a version of that. Here are some little green triangles trying to click into the receptors. If those red ones weren't blocking the receptor, they would click into the receptors and the postsynaptic neuron would fire. But because those red ones are blocking the receptors, well, then that neuron is not going to fire. This is a really important system in your brain. This is how you have self control. This is how you control certain parts of your body. This is how you stop yourself from having constant intrusive thoughts about if something is dirty or if someone's going to hurt you, right? We all have intrusive thoughts sometimes. What if I left the stove on? But most of the time, most people go like, oh no, I'm sure that I turned it off. That ability comes from this system, sending out GABA, which is a neurotransmitter, to block certain receptors so that that signal doesn't get repeated and you don't have constant intrusive thoughts. Now, regardless of which neurotransmitter is released, eventually those neurotransmitters are going to have to be gotten rid of. They're going to have to go back. So let's look at this one again. The neurotransmitters are released. They click into the receptors, but they can't stay in there. This is a very weak chemical bond between the neurotransmitter and the receptor. So eventually, they're just going to click out. Okay. And there are going to be these other chemicals that will catch them to bring them back into the terminal button. Okay. If this didn't happen, if the process that we call reuptake didn't happen, when those chemicals latch themselves to the postsynaptic neuron, it would make the postsynaptic neuron fire. We know that. But then eventually they would click off because, like I mentioned, it's a very weak bond. But because they'd linger there, they would eventually click again onto other receptors and it would make the neuron fire again. If you go back to that example of intrusive thoughts, this is essentially what's happening. The chemicals are clicking out and then just clicking back in, making the neuron fire, triggering that intrusive thought again. And again, if you don't ever reuptake, then they will just keep on doing this, and there's no way to stop it. When you think about certain drugs, this is happening. Drugs like cocaine prevent reuptake from taking charge, and so these chemicals just keep on activating neurons in your brain. And depending on the drug you're taking, well, they make you feel a certain way or think a certain way. And you really have no control over it because the chemical, in this case, the cocaine, is stopping you from having normal control over your brain. Of course, if you do have reuptake, then that allows you to bring back those neurotransmitters into the terminal button. Now, this process of a neuron getting triggered, sending that impulse down the axon, releasing neurotransmitters, which triggers another impulse, which triggers neurotransmitters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is happening in your body nonstop, okay? Millions, billions of times every single second as you're listening to me speak to you, as you are seeing the screen, as you're texting, as your heart's beating, as your blood flow is slowing down or speeding up. Almost everything that's happening in your body, conscious, unconscious, is using this system to maintain control of your body, its movement, your behavior, your thoughts and emotions, uh, your understanding, cognition, all of those things. Now, I've been talking about an electrical impulse going through your axon. And uh, one of the biggest problems with understanding is that where is this electricity coming from? We, unlike our devices, don't need batteries. We don't even think about energy. This is because the energy that we use is created through foods, and specifically in our brains, there are ions that exist in our in the fluid in our brain, and some of these ions are positive, and some of these ions are negative. And when the gates in your axons open and close, they let in positive ions, which then in turn push out some of the negative ions inside of your axon. Inside of your axon, there's usually negative ions. But when the gates open up, this shifts and changes. And the whole process creates a low level electrical impulse. And it doesn't just happen once, it happens over and over and over again throughout the axon in less than a second, sending a signal down the axon. Now, what you're seeing here is an example of how positive ions are coming in and negative ions are being pushed out, and then it goes back to normal. Now, the process, when it happens in one of the gates, pushes the next gate to trigger, to open or close. And that makes the next gate open or close, which makes the next gate open or close, which makes the next gate open or close. And again, this is happening immediately, right? Here you see it very, very fast. That change between positive and negative going all the way down your axon, that is what we're talking about when we're talking about an electrical impulse. And here's another visualization of that coming, the ions coming in and out, and then sort of being pushed down the axon. Now, if you were to see this under a microscope, unless you have a very powerful microscope, what you would see is an electrical signal, an electrical impulse going down the axon. All right, so I've been talking a little bit about neurotransmitters, and I'm going to talk about a handful of them. Different neurotransmitters do different things in your brain and body. And what I'm going to talk about are kind of umbrella functions, because the truth is that a neurotransmitter might do one thing in your brain and do a completely different thing in your body. It might do one thing in your heart and a completely different thing in your stomach. It might do one thing in your frontal lobe and a completely different thing in your amygdala, because our brain is incredibly specialized. But what I'm going to talk about here are some umbrella aspects of neurotransmitters. And the first one I'm going to talk about is acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is used for muscle reactions. your brain sends acetylcholine to your muscles to make your muscle either constrict or relax. This is how you have muscle movement, whether it's me speaking right now, controlling my larynx to let out air out of my mouth, or you're taking notes maybe, or maybe you're driving a car right now and you're shifting your foot or the pedals. Um, uh, all of those movements are created through acetylcholine. Now, acetylcholine also helps you with memory in your hippocampus, and it also creates pain in your body. Um, if you've ever heard of Botox, people use Botox and they put it in their face because when Botox, the chemical Botox, comes in contact with acetylcholine, it destroys acetylcholine. And so, if my brain is sending signals to my face, to the muscles in my face, to smile or frown, well, the doctor went and put some Botox in my face. So before the acetylcholine clicks into the receptors in my face muscles, the Botox gets to it first and breaks it apart. And then the acetylcholine never gets to my face. This prevents me from smiling or frowning. And people do this because smiles and frowns create wrinkles. And so people would rather never smile than to have a wrinkle. It's very sad. But some people use it in their in their scalp on the top of their heads because some people suffer from migraines. And so the same way that the Botox stops you from sending signals uh, to the face muscles, well, the same thing happens backwards in the scalp when the muscle around the scalp sends signals that there is pain. The Botox destroys that acetylcholine before it ever even starts going to the brain. And so the brain doesn't feel the migraine. Um, now, um, let me give you another little example here. Oh, by the way, if you're running, if you're doing exercises, all of those movements are going to be acetylcholine. Now, we talked about pain, and I want to give you an example. Every once in a while, you are, I don't know, cooking, and maybe you grab a pot that's a little too hot without realizing it. Your natural reaction is going to be to release that hot pan and let it fall. Again, this is because your the pain is signal is being sent to your brain. That's acetylcholine, and your brain is sending um, a signal down to your hand to release, and that's also going to be acetylcholine. And so now you release that hot pan, and it falls to the ground. But not always, right? Sometimes you can grab on to that pot for just a little bit longer, even if it's hot, just enough to put it down on the counter or something like that. So, what's the difference? How come sometimes you grab a hot pot and you let it go before you even think about it? And sometimes you grab a hot pot and you can hold on to it just for another moment so you can put it down. Well, that's another neurotransmitter, which we call GABA. And what GABA does is that it blocks other neurotransmitters from working. Um, this is like the one that we saw, the uh, blocking in, where GABA clicks into the receptors, preventing other neurotransmitters from clicking into the receptor. So when you're grabbing onto that hot pan, it becomes a race, right? Probably your brain stem, maybe your limbic system or parts of your limbic system are going to be sending uh, acetylcholine down to your hand. And if the acetylcholine gets to your hand first, you're going to drop that pot, it's going to fall. But your frontal lobe usually um, doesn't want you to drop that pot because it's going to make a mess, or you made some food for your grandma and you really want her to eat it or something. And your frontal lobe is going to try and send GABA down to the hand. And if GABA gets to your hands first, to the receptors in your hand, well, then they'll block the acetylcholine from clicking in there. And so you'll be able to hold on to that pot for just another moment until you can put it down. Now, that's not the only thing that GABA does. GABA is also the neurotransmitter that helps you to block intrusive thoughts. As I mentioned, we all have intrusive thoughts. What if someone stole my car? What if I left the coffee maker on? What if my middle school teacher remembers that one embarrassing thing I did on the 8th grade? Right? We all have thoughts like that. Now, some of us have GABA, and GABA comes in and goes, stop. What if stop? And then you're like, yeah, that's dumb to think about that. And you block uh, those thoughts from recurring over and over and over again. Some people either don't have enough GABA or they underutilize it because their level of anxiety is so high, they really just underutilize their GABA. And these individuals never have this what if stop because there's not enough GABA there. And so instead, uh, those thoughts just continue to occur over and over and over again. All right. Now, the next neurotransmitter I want to talk about is norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is a kind of like a cousin to adrenaline, right? Sometimes it's called noradrenaline. And norepinephrine is your good stress hormone. This is the stress hormone you like to have. When you're playing a sport, this is the stress hormone that gets you excited, that makes you, want to push forward. It makes you feel like you have energy, like you can keep on going. If you've ever had an essay you forgot to write and all of a sudden you remember, I only have an hour to get this down, and you get in front of your computer and you pound an essay out, that was norepinephrine that pushed you to do that, right? It sort of filled you up with a stress that you were able to use as utilize as energy. It pumps your heart, it makes blood flow to your arms and legs, to your face. um, if you've ever been laying around and you want to clean your room, let's say, and you go, oh, I'm so tired. I don't feel like, cleaning my room. I don't feel like doing anything. And then your crush calls and your crush says, hey, I'm going to stop by. Whew, and then all of a sudden, you feel energy just coming all the way through your body, and now you're rushing, cleaning everything up so your crush doesn't see a messy room, right? Sometimes your parents will tell you something like, when your friends call you, you always have energy to go out, but when I ask you to do something, you're always too tired. You know why that happens? Norepinephrine. When mom is asking you to do that, well, your brain doesn't release norepinephrine. There's no reason to. There's no reason for your brain to feel excited about that. And so you feel super tired. Now, as soon as your friends call, your brain will release norepinephrine, and you all of a sudden have a lot of energy. You totally feel like doing something. Norepinephrine also helps with sleep. If you've ever woken up and you're just too exhausted to even move out of your bed, this is because you lack norepinephrine. Obviously, this is good when you're sleeping. You don't want norepinephrine because then you can't fall asleep. If you've ever uh, try to go to bed, even if you're tired, but your legs just feel like let me just shake them. I just feel like they're too active, or you can't find the right position on your bed. You just keep on tossing and turning. That's because you had too much norepinephrine in your system. In order to fall asleep, you need to have little to no norepinephrine in most of your body. But if you wake up and you have no norepinephrine, well, now you can't even move out of your bed. You just don't feel like it. But All of a sudden, you look at the clock and you realize that you're already late. And what happens? Now you can jump out of bed and you're rushing out. Again, because the norepinephrine has been pushed into your body and now you're super active. Let me make one more point here, which is if you don't have enough norepinephrine throughout the day, this is what depression is, or part of depression. This is specifically the part of depression where they feel tired, they feel like they can't move, like they don't want to get out of bed or they don't want to get out of the couch. Sometimes you will call somebody's name, and if they have depression, it looks like their head is super heavy. They can barely move their head to look your way. This is because they don't have enough norepinephrine and they feel like they have no energy. The opposite of that, if you are someone with anxiety or someone who is having a manic episode, that means that your norepinephrine is too high. Your heart's beating really fast. And if you're manic, you might just start running, or you might take off all your clothes and maybe you start a fight with someone because you just feel super active. So, all right. The next neurotransmitter I want to talk about is dopamine. And dopamine is everything you've ever loved. Okay. This is the feelings of anticipation and reward. When your crush calls you and you're like, oh, I can't wait to talk to this person. I'm so excited and I'm so happy and excited that they call. That feeling of anticipation and the reward feeling of talking to them, that's dopamine that's creating that. When mom makes you your favorite dish and you're like, oh, I can't wait to eat this, right? That's dopamine that's doing that to you. Everything you've ever loved, every excitement that you have, that is dopamine that is creating that feeling of anticipation and reward. If you've ever had a little kid tell you every Pokemon they know, this Pokemon is this Pokemon, and this Pokemon does this, and this Pokemon you can only find in this Poke Place or whatever. Um, that is also dopamine. Dopamine helps you to want to learn things and then to express them, right? You want to tell people the things you've learned. You want to try out the things you've learned. And that is dopamine that is creating that. Um, uh, Now, dopamine is also what almost every addictive drug that you take controls or messes up. Um, Dopamine controls your rewards pathways in your limbic system and frontal lobe. And when you take drugs, your drugs release more dopamine, or sometimes they act like a dopamine, which increases that feeling of anticipation and reward, which makes you want to do the drug again. Every once in a while, you will, I don't know, maybe you'll have a food. Let's say you have pasta, and the pasta makes you sick. And then you know what happens? You never want to have pasta again. You feel disgusted by it. But if you drink a little bit too much, you guys are probably around the right age where you're having a little bit too much to drink every once in a while. You drink too much and you go, I'm never having another drink again, ever again, because you're so sick, you're so hungover, you threw up all last night, and you go, I'm never having another drink again. Until Friday comes along and you, I'll have another beer, right? That's because even though your body has this way of getting you to not eat and drink things that are going to make you sick, the alcohol here is acting on your rewards pathways with dopamine. And so, even though you got sick last time, you also had this great moment, or while the dopamine was rushing in your brain, turning on your rewards pathways. And so, your brain remembers that as well. And that becomes more powerful than the feeling of disgust created by the alcohol. Um, Now, also, depression also makes dopamine go low. So, if you've ever heard that someone with depression um, stops doing things they used to once enjoy. So maybe they used to love going to the movie theater and now they don't want to go to the movie theater. They used to love hanging out with their friends, but now they don't really feel like hanging out with friends. This is because dopamine is low. And remember that what dopamine does is anticipation and reward. And so if you don't have feelings of anticipation, well, then going to the movies doesn't seem very fun because there's no feeling of anticipation. And even if you go, there's no feeling of reward. And so you don't enjoy it. Um, and so low levels of dopamine basically make people not want to do things because they don't think they're going to enjoy them, or because when they do them, they don't enjoy them because there's not enough dopamine. Dopamine at very high levels could mean that the person is schizophrenic. This will create delusions, believing things that are clearly not true, and maybe even hallucinations. Drugs will also increase dopamine, and oftentimes it will increase dopamine so high that you will have uh, hallucinations or delusions where you see things that are not there, hear things that are not there, or delusions, you believe things that are not real. Um, Someone on cocaine might tell you that they want to go to Mexico to start a business, or that they're going to, I don't know, go to a club and they're going to, you know, race car driving, just crazy things they'll just start saying. And they have like a million things that they want to do. I want to do this. I want to do that. I want to do this. I want to do that. And you go, well, that what you're saying doesn't make any sense, especially if you want to try to do them all. You're just jumping from one thing to another. That's because their dopamine is too high. Now, the last neurotransmitter I want to talk about that's directly related to depression is serotonin. Now, first of all, serotonin is your mood regulator. If you have normal amounts of serotonin, you feel good, just in general, just in general about life. Um, think about maybe you thought that you were going to fail a test and you didn't, you passed. And then it's not just that you feel good and happy, is you feel good and happy like the rest of the day. It makes you feel good just in general for the rest of the day or for the next couple of days. This is uh, essentially a happy mood. The opposite sometimes happens too. You thought you were going to pass that test and you didn't. And now you feel bummed out, not just now, but for a couple of hours, maybe even a day or two, right? Maybe you heard someone at work saying something rude about you and it just ruins your whole day. Or say something nice about you. They didn't know you were listening in and they said something nice. Oh, that made your whole day. And now you feel good for the next week or so. This is what serotonin regulates. If you have normal serotonin levels, you feel good. When you win at a game, when you know that people like you, when your life is going well, your serotonin levels are high. You'll notice that there are some rhesus monkeys there at the bottom. Rhesus monkeys are a great animal to do serotonin research on. Why? Because rhesus monkeys have a very strict hierarchy. And so if you are an alpha, a high ranking male, then you get everything you want. You can steal food from whoever you want, usually beat up the smaller guys, the older guys. All the girls want to be with you. And you know what happens when we look at these monkeys? Their serotonin levels are super high. When we look at some of those low ranked monkeys and they get beat up and their food gets taken away and the girls don't like them, you know what happens? Their serotonin levels are super low because their life is awful. Now, unlike humans, though, you can't be an alpha forever. One rhesus monkey can't be an alpha his whole life. Eventually, he's going to get too old, and some of these younger uh, rhesus monkeys are going to start to get bigger and stronger. And if, let's say, rhesus monkey number one starts getting bigger and stronger, and they start going up the ranks, and they start getting closer and closer to being an alpha, what do we see? their serotonin levels are going up and up and up because their life is getting better. They're enjoying their life more. Now, if you happen to be rhesus monkey number 2, and even though you're getting older, you're still not going up in the ranks, you're still low ranked, well, you know what happens with serotonin? Nothing. It still stays low. Um, and the same thing, or the opposite way, is going up with the alpha. As that alpha gets older and weaker, and they don't have as much standing, and they start going lower in the ranks, well, their serotonin levels often start to go down. It gets even more interesting if you look at mean rhesus monkeys versus nice rhesus monkeys. So if you have a alpha that was very nice to the younger rhesus monkeys, and they didn't always steal food and they didn't always treat the young rhesus monkeys badly, well, when they get older, the young rhesus monkeys who are now alphas and high ranked, they don't treat the old rhesus monkey badly because they remember, hey, this guy wasn't mean to me, and they treat him nicely. And so his serotonin levels don't go down as much. But if you have an alpha that was really mean to the young ones, and they all beat up all the young ones, and they stole food even when they didn't need it, etc., when he starts to get old, the new alphas come along and they remember, hey, that guy was a jerk to us, and they treat him bad and they steal food from him, and they sometimes ostracize him, and that old rhesus monkey, his serotonin levels are going to get very, very low. Now, I told you that serotonin was related to depression, and serotonin is the depression part of depression. It's the part that creates sadness and dark moods and global negativity, where people think everything's bad and no one likes me, and this will never end, and I feel like dying. Death might be better. All of those feelings of darkness and dark thoughts, and we call that global negativity, and that's directly related to serotonin. This is in part why we give people with depression SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They stop the reuptake of serotonin so that people with depression, their mood can be elevated over time. And sometimes it takes weeks or months before it starts taking effect. But sure enough, if it goes up high enough, if their serotonin levels go up high enough, they start to feel better in general. Um, Drugs like Prozac also increase serotonin levels. Let me make sure that I'm not missing something I want to say here. Okay. The next neurotransmitter is endorphins. And endorphins mediate the feelings of pleasure and pain. If you've ever been in a fight, especially in a fight where it took a little bit of a buildup, maybe you were arguing for a little while before you got hit. Well, sometimes you get hit, and that hit should have hurt. They split your lip open. Maybe they, hit you in the arm or on the leg, and you know that it should have hurt. But in that moment, it doesn't hurt. Nothing almost hurts. That's because endorphins block the feelings of pain here. If you've ever been to the gym, especially if you've been to the gym after a long while, and maybe you did a lot of weight training, while you're in the gym, you feel great because you have a lot of endorphins, and you don't feel pain. But the next day, when the endorphins have died down, how do you feel? Usually incredibly sore. That's because while you were working out, while you were lifting weights, all these little micro tears were occurring in your muscles. That's important. That's how your muscles get bigger. But those micro tears should hurt. The endorphins prevented you from feeling the pain, the soreness, while you were working out. But the next day, without the endorphins, then all of a sudden you feel the pain all at once. By the way, in that fight, when you got that lip burst open. Well, in that moment, you don't feel it. But in an hour or two, when the endorphins have gone down, now you feel it, and you feel your lip pounding because the pain is quite high. People, endorphins sometimes prevent people from feeling even things that you can't imagine, stab wounds or bullets, or sometimes like literally being hit with an axe or something like that. Um, Sometimes people will say things like, "Oh, my adrenaline was rushing so much, I didn't even feel it." But it's not adrenaline that's doing that to you. It's endorphins. Usually, endorphins come at the same time as adrenaline is coming, but not necessarily always. Um, all right. Now, this neurotransmitter is oxytocin. And oxytocin is one of my favorite neurotransmitters. I think it's very interesting. But if you're a lady, there's a good chance that you hate oxytocin at least for a week every month, right? Because in your body, oxytocin is one of the chemicals that creates cramps in a lady's uterus during menstruation. When a mom is pregnant and she's ready to give birth, oxytocin with similar chemicals are what push the baby out of the uterus. They make the uterus constrict and push the baby out. But in your brain, oxytocin does something very, very different. And what it does is that it makes you bond with whoever is there next to you while your oxytocin is being released. You might have heard that love and friendship evolved from the mother child relationship. When people say that, they're talking about oxytocin. Mom releases oxytocin, obviously, while she's giving birth, but also while she's breastfeeding. And this in the body, as I mentioned, affects the uterus, affects the breast milk, but it also affects the brain, and it makes mom feel bonded to that baby. The baby will also release oxytocin, which will make the baby feel bonded to mom. Now, if you're a human, if you are another social species, an ape, a wolf, things like that, we use oxytocin for other relationships, romantic relationships, for one, right? Uh, you will release oxytocin when you have sex. This is why, after having sex with someone, you often feel bonded to them. Um, but you will also release oxytocin when you look at someone in the eye, especially a friend, when you hug someone or hold their hand. Um, all of these things, all of these social behaviors and interactions will release oxytocin, which will make you feel bonded to your friend, to your husband or wife, boyfriend or girlfriend, to your mom and dad, to your dog. When you pet your dog, when you play with your dog, you release oxytocin, and so does your dog. And so you feel bonded to your dog, and your dog also feels bonded to you. This also works with cats. Um, some people keep snakes, and when you pet your snake, you will release oxytocin and you will feel bonded to that snake. But that snake is always just trying to eat you. Oxytocin is a neurotransmitter that bonding reaction is something that happens in mammals, and isn't doesn't happen in every other kind of species. All right. Now, the last neurotransmitter I want to talk about is glutamate. And if you ever go into neurology or neuroscience, glutamate is an important neurotransmitter. It's super complex and it's very interesting. People who are in neuroscience often will tell you glutamate is my favorite neurotransmitter. But for us, it's kind of just your generic neurotransmitter. This is your great value Walmart brand neurotransmitter. You use it for everything, for thinking and learning and memory all throughout your body. And so it kind of just feels it's not very special. The one thing that makes it special is that you use it basically in everything. Now, the one thing that's kind of interesting about glutamate is that it's almost the exact same chemical as something that we eat, which we call MSG. It's a chemical. And MSG tastes good, and so they will put it in certain foods. And usually people put it in Chinese takeout food. Not always, because if you put too much MSG on something, it could become toxic. And so there is sort of a push against using MSG. Why is MSG toxic? Because when you ingest MSG, sometimes if you ingest enough of it, you will confuse your body. And so your body is going to be like, what is the brain trying to tell me? What is all this glutamate doing here? Because of course the MSG is just like glutamate. And sometimes that will create toxic levels in your body. Okay. Um, Now, the last thing I want to talk about is hormones. Now, we call the hormone system the endocrine system because they work through your blood, where neurotransmitters go through your nerves, and they are immediate. Your endocrine system is quite slow in comparison. It's not actually slow. If you've ever been to uh, maybe the doctor, maybe you had a high fever, or you were in a lot of pain for some reason, you had surgery, and they gave you morphine, and they put morphine in your blood. And usually, what happens is you feel like a numbness go through your arm, and like that warm, numb feeling enters your chest area, and it goes down to your legs, and then you kind of feel it in the rest of your body, and then up into your head until you start feeling better. Um, that process can take 3 seconds, 5 seconds before the morphine is active in all your body. So that's still pretty fast. It's just that compared to your nervous system, it's super slow. Because, for example, if you close your eyes right now, your everything goes away. It just black right away. And as soon as you open your eyes, that picture comes back right away. It's immediate because uh, your nerves, your nervous system works really fast in comparison to your endocrine system. Your endocrine system also is controlled by a bunch of glands. The main one is the hypothalamus, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next video. That's your master gland. And it basically controls all of your other glands, your pituitary gland, your thyroid and parathyroid gland, your adrenal gland, your pancreas. If you're a lady, your ovaries. If you're a gentleman, your testes. Uh, all of these glands create hormones, and those hormones are released into your blood system depending on what it is that you need to do. Does your body need to turn fat into glucose? Does your body need to turn excess glucose into fat? Do we need adrenaline in the system? Do we need testosterone or estrogen in the system? These systems are all, or I should say, these hormones are being created by the different glands in your body, which usually are controlled by your hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus is usually the first thing that gets turned on to send signals to whichever gland needs to turn on or create a hormone. Let me say one more thing. Even though getting the hormone into your body can be fast, as I mentioned, 3 to 5 seconds. Getting it out of your system can take a long time, hours sometimes. So that maybe you heard someone say something rude about you, and in 2 to 3 seconds, you went from being really calm to being super angry. That's because adrenaline, norepinephrine was released into your bloodstream. And now your heart starts beating fast and your face gets flushed, etc. And again, it only took 3 to 5 seconds. But let's say immediately after that, you realize that, oh, that person wasn't even talking about me. And so now you know in your brain, you know that you were wrong, that there's no reason to be upset. But sometimes you can't control that. You still feel angry because your body still feels angry. Your muscles are still tense. Your heart is still beating. You have adrenaline and cortisol rushing through your body, and so you have that icky, yucky feeling in your body, and you feel upset and aggravated. And sometimes you tell yourself, there's nothing to be upset about, but I still feel so angry, right? Because there's a difference between what your nervous system, your brain, is thinking and what your body is thinking. Now, in a perfect world, your brain would go, yeah, listen, this is hormone in my body. I just have to wait an hour or two before it goes away. I'm not upset. But that doesn't always happen. In fact, it rarely happens. Usually the opposite happens. Your body is so angry, you convince your brain that in fact you are angry. And sometimes your brain just comes up with another reason to be upset, maybe at a different person, or maybe at the same person for a different reason. Your brain will just kind of make something up because we're not super rational all the time. It would make sense for you to be able to say, yeah, this feeling of aggravation, this has nothing to do with reality. It's just my body, it's just hormones. Let me wait a little bit and relax until these hormones go away. But that's very hard to do. Very few people do that. And it's much more likely that we go, I'm so angry. That's the real reason why I'm angry. And now you just make up a reason and you aggravate yourself even further. All right, guys. This is the end of this video. In the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit. By the way, that's just a list there. In the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the different parts of the nervous system. I'm going to talk about the brain, tell you about different parts of the brain and what they do. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we study the brain.